Is this some kind of joke? The voice, dripping with condescension, echoed across the parking lot, cutting through the morning air like a knife. It belonged to Jack Carter, leader of a notorious gang of bikers who'd made their home in this corner of town. He stood there, eyes narrowed with disdain, as he stared down at the old man in front of him. Martin Kelly, 75, didn't flinch. His weathered face, marked by time and memories, remained calm, his gaze unwavering. Jack didn't like that. The old man's silence only fueled his arrogance. He took a step forward, sizing him up like a lion circling a wounded prey. What's this? A relic from the past? Jack scoffed, his voice loud enough for the whole gang to hear. What's an old man like you doing here? You lost, Grandpa. Martin's eyes drifted away from the bikers, focusing on a nearby diner. The heat of the summer sun bore down, but his demeanor was cool, unaffected by the insults. I'm just here to meet an old friend, Martin replied softly, his voice carrying the weight of years and unspoken history. A friend? Jack repeated, mocking him. Who? Your fellow war buddies. The bikers laughed, a rough, almost menacing sound that filled the space between the old man and the gang. Martin remained silent, his hands folded gently in his lap, not bothering to respond to their jeers. They couldn't understand, couldn't see the truth behind his quiet demeanor. He had saved a young officer, Wallace, whose life had been hanging by a thread. The pain of the memory was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the weight of the promise Wallace had made to him, the promise he would carry with him for the rest of his life. One day, I'll owe you a debt, Wallace had said, blood seeping through his uniform, his voice hoarse from pain. Martin had never expected repayment. He had done what was needed, because that was what men like him did. But today, in this moment, standing before a group of men who didn't know him, who didn't understand, he couldn't help but wonder. Was today the day that promise would be fulfilled? As Joe continued to mock him, Martin reached up, his fingers brushing the pen, a small piece of history, of a life lived in service to something greater than himself. It was just a pin to these men, but to him, it was the symbol of everything he had fought for, of the men he had saved, of the lives lost. I've seen worse, Martin muttered under his breath, his voice steady but filled with a quiet strength. The bikers paused, sensing the change in the air. It was like the tension in the room had shifted, as if the very ground beneath them had started to hum with something more than just the heat of the summer day. Joe, still holding the pen, was about to speak when a voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. Is there a problem here? The voice belonged to a man in a military uniform, sharp, immaculate, and unmistakable. The bikers froze, their laughter dying in their throats. The man who spoke was a Navy SEL, and he was not alone. And if you don't leave now, I'll make sure you regret it. The bikers exchanged nervous glances, realizing they had pushed things too far. One by one, they began to back away, their pride giving way to the sudden understanding that they were no match for the men who had just arrived. Jack, still seething, shot one last glance at Martin, but said nothing. With a final growl, he turned and motioned for his gang to follow. As the bikers retreated into the distance, Martin stood there, watching them go. The SEALs didn't move, their eyes trained on the retreating figures. The tension in the air began to dissipate, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to calm. The old veteran didn't need to say a word. He didn't need to explain. His past had already spoken for him. The sound of heavy boots on gravel echoed across the parking lot as Martin stood there, unmoving, his eyes still fixed on the distant diner. The heat of the summer day pressed down on him, but his composure remained unbroken. The bikers had gone, their arrogance and bravado replaced by confusion and fear. The Navy SEALs stood like statues behind him, their presence a silent promise of protection. The world felt still, the tension hanging in the air like a thick fog, but Martin knew better than to celebrate just yet. He had lived through moments like this before, moments when the world shifted on its axis, and the truth came crashing down in unexpected ways. As he turned, the SEALs made way for him, their eyes respectful but distant, as if they knew better than to intrude on his thoughts. The old man's slow steps echoed in the quiet, each one deliberate, each one carrying the weight of a lifetime of service and sacrifice. He had been through more than any of them could ever know, and yet, here he was, walking through the same world that seemed to forget him at every turn. He had been a shadow for so long, a ghost of a past that no one seemed to care about. But not today. Not today. As Martin approached the diner's door, he paused, glancing over his shoulder at the seals, who had begun to fall back into formation. One of them, a younger man with a hard jaw and a gaze that was as intense as it was respectful, stepped forward. "Are you all right, sir?" the young seal asked, his voice low, his tone sincere. Martin nodded, his eyes softening for the first time since the bikers had approached. "I'm fine," he said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of everything he had experienced. "But thank you." The seal gave a slight nod and stepped back, his hand never leaving the rifle slung across his chest. Martin didn't need any more reassurance. He had fought battles that would haunt most men for a lifetime. A few rude words from a group of bikers weren't going to break him. The diner door swung open with a soft creak, the bell above it ringing as Martin stepped inside. The familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, and for a moment, the world felt like it had slowed down. The clatter of plates and the murmur of conversation faded as the patrons turned their heads to look at him. They were quiet now, their curiosity evident in their eyes. Martin took a deep breath, letting the air settle in his lungs. He wasn't here for their attention. He wasn't here for their respect. He was here for one thing only: closure. The waitress behind the counter, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, looked up at him. She recognized him immediately. "Martin Kelly," she said softly, her voice a mix of awe and surprise. "I didn't know you still came here." Martin gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Old habits die hard," he said, his voice low and calm. He walked to the counter, taking a seat at the far end. As he sat, the quiet of the diner seemed to deepen, the silence growing heavier with each passing second. He could feel their eyes on him, the unspoken questions in the air, but he ignored them. This was his moment, and he wasn't about to let anyone take it from him. The young seals were still outside, standing guard, their sharp eyes scanning the street. Martin knew they were there for him, but he didn't need their protection right now. The past had caught up with him, and he was ready to face it. As the waitress poured his coffee, he glanced at the door again. For a moment, he thought he saw a shadow move, but when he looked again, it was gone. The world had changed. His past had found him, and in that moment, he realized something that he had always known deep down. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't just a ghost. He was still here, and for the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him. It wasn't anger. It wasn't regret. It was something deeper, something that had been buried for far too long. The diner grew quieter as the people inside continued to watch him, but Martin didn't care. He wasn't here to explain. He wasn't here to justify. He was here for something else entirely, for a moment of peace, for a chance to remember the men he had saved, and the ones who had never come home. The hum of the diner's fluorescent lights was almost deafening in the stillness that had settled over the room. The seconds stretched on as Martin sat there, his coffee untouched, his mind lost in the memories of years long past. He had thought he left it all behind: the sweat, the blood, the promises, and the loss. But here it was, creeping back in, surrounding him, reminding him of the men he had saved and the ones who never made it back. His fingers curled around the mug, the warmth grounding him, but the weight in his chest remained heavy. He could still hear Wallace's voice in his head, calling out for help, his last words haunting him like an echo. He hadn't realized just how much he had buried until now. The sound of the doorbell jingled, snapping him out of his reverie. He turned to see a man walk in, a tall, imposing figure, his uniform sharp and crisply pressed. Martin didn't need to look twice to recognize him. The diner's chatter continued around them, but in that moment, it was as if the world had narrowed down to just the two of them. Hayes stepped forward, his boots clicking softly against the floor, and came to a stop in front of Martin. The air between them seemed to crackle with history. "I didn't expect to see you here," Hayes said, his voice steady, but there was something in his tone, a softness, a reverence that caught Martin off guard. "Thought you'd left all this behind." Martin gave a small, knowing smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. The words seemed to reverberate in Martin's ears, and for a moment, he felt a rush of emotions, surprise, disbelief, but also a sense of closure. It was as if a chapter of his life he had long since closed had suddenly been flung open again. "Waiting for you, Martin. He's never stopped looking for you." Martin nodded, but he didn't say anything. And sacrifice. Martin, he said softly, I've been waiting for this moment, for a long time. Martin nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of the past. Wallace smiled at that, a small, knowing smile that held a lifetime of memories. You're right, he said softly. We all did. But it's time to acknowledge what you did. It's time to give you the credit you deserve. The words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. Martin didn't know how to react, didn't know how to process the depth of what Wallace was offering. It's not about credit, Martin said quietly. It's about the ones who didn't make it back. The ones who never had the chance to see this day. Wallace's face softened, his expression filled with a quiet understanding. I know, he said, his voice thick with emotion. And that's why we're here. To make sure you know that your sacrifice wasn't in vain, that you're not forgotten. For the first time in years, Martin felt the knot in his chest loosen. The weight, the loneliness, the feeling of being invisible, it all seemed to lift, just for a moment. He didn't need the world to know his name, didn't need the recognition. But hearing these words, from someone who had fought beside him, meant more than he could ever put into words. Thank you, Martin said, his voice barely above a whisper. Wallace nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. You've earned more than you'll ever know, Martin. The two men sat there in silence for a moment, the past and present converging in that small room. For the first time in a long time, Martin felt something he hadn't in years, peace. He was home, not just in the place he had once fought for, but in the recognition of what he had done, of what he had given. And in that moment, as the weight of the years seemed to fall away, he knew that the promise had been fulfilled, not just for Wallace, but for himself as well. As the days passed, Martin found himself becoming more and more acclimated to his new role at the base. It wasn't just the physical work that had changed, there was a shift inside him, something deeper, something he hadn't expected. The routine of the base, the soldiers marching in formation, the constant hum of activity, all seemed to be a reminder of a life he thought he had left behind. But it wasn't the chaos of battle or the isolation of the field that had been weighing.